Glad you could be with us on this Monday. How do supporters of the Second Amendment respond when there's a mass shooting like the one yesterday in South Texas? We're joined now by Emily Taylor, partner at Walker & Taylor, a firm in Houston, which also provides independent program attorneys for U.S. Law Shield, a Second Amendment voice. Emily, how do you see this?
Although Texas is very firearm friendly, it's also a fairly red state still, we do have our large city centers are very liberal, and they do tend to be pretty anti-gun.
All right, so in a situation like this, where people inevitably will say, see, this is why we don't or can't allow guns, what does, say, a group like U.S. Law Shield say?
Well, we have a lot to learn still about this particular awful incident, but at the end of the day, what we as Second Amendment advocates maintain is that it's not the firearm that's committing these atrocities, and that curbing firearm ownership by people who should be in possession of firearms, people like you or I who have a license to carry, who simply carry for our own self-defense and protection of ourselves and our family, should not be curtailed from that action. People who actually are licensed to carry firearms in the state of Texas, year after year, the statistic comes out that they are less likely to commit a criminal act than a police officer is. So, generally, when we look at these instances, we have to say we need to figure out what is causing people to commit these horrible acts rather than focusing on the object with which they have committed it.
This has been going on, the argument, I guess I'll say, has been going on forever. Do we actually look at what's going on or what's wrong, or how perhaps the wrong people are getting firearms?
I don't know that we actually do a lot of serious introspection as a country after these incidences. Unfortunately, it's people have a lot of emotion tied to it when we start these discussions, and I don't think that we get very far. But I think that certainly a discussion into whether the federal processes and procedures for gun ownership, the checks and balances are working, is a conversation we should have, and I am confident that they do, in fact, work. But I think that there is nothing to, as Second Amendment advocates, there is nothing to hide in the shadows about in the wake of these incidences.
We're speaking with Emily Taylor. She's a partner at the law firm Walker & Taylor in Houston. They are independent program attorneys for U.S. Law Shield. We're talking about this shooting in South Texas at this church. I know you're a former prosecutor. You certainly have seen these types of things before, I'm sure, from one side of the table. Why do people do this generally? Is this, I guess I'm asking you to play junior shrink, maybe, perhaps leaning on your experience. Is this people who are disturbed? Is this hate born from home? Like, where does this come from?
Almost always there is something in the way of mental illness. And I know that that's what the anti-gun people like to get angry about when they hear those of us who are Second Amendment advocates trying to chalk it all up to mental illness. But that is if there are two constants in a mass shooting, it's the gun and the mental illness. We see it virtually every single time. And I think that, unfortunately, we don't address that part of this in our nation very well.
Any reason why? Any theory as to why we don't address that well?
My theory is that it's very, very complicated. Blaming the firearm itself is the simple answer. But talking about how we should look at mental health, how we talk about it currently, the stigmas we attach to it, the difficulties that some people have accessing care, those are really difficult, taxing conversations to have. The easier conversation is, we'll ban the guns. It's the guns' fault.
Thanks, Emily. That is Emily Taylor, again, partner at Walker & Taylor in Houston.
Let's talk a little bit about the Texas killer, and we're learning horrific stuff about the guy who's just a horrible human being, and of course ended with a horrific crime. 4% of Sutherland Springs population was killed in that crime. 4%. It's a very small town. Everybody there impacted by it in some way. But one of the things we learned yesterday was there was a failure by the Air Force And that led to him being able to legally buy this gun. I want to bring in Emily Taylor. She's with U.S. Law Shield. She's a gun law expert to talk about it. Emily, how are you this morning?
Oh, I'm doing fine. How are you?
Doing really well. Let's start with this because the report was that he lied on his form when he had a gun background check at the sporting goods store where he bought his rifle. But of course, lying on it doesn't really help you because the background check is supposed to catch you in the lie. The problem was, even though he was found guilty of domestic violence in the Air Force, court-martialed, served a year in jail, domestic violence does not allow you to buy a gun, whether it's a misdemeanor or felony. It wasn't connected and reported to the FBI database, correct?
That's correct. And if you'll recall, this actually isn't the first time we've seen this kind of failure. The federal laws we have in place are very good at catching people who should not have access to firearms. But unfortunately, the people who have to report convictions to the federal government they're just people. They make mistakes, and it wasn't that long ago that we had the Louisiana movie theater shooting at the Amy Schumer movie, in which the Louisiana court system failed to report a disqualifying event, which allowed that shooter to buy a gun.
Yeah, and it happens a lot. My first job out of college was felony probation and parole officer. And now this was back in 1990 and the computers weren't as good, but there's a national criminal database that I would check. And then there was a state database that I would check. And a lot of the state stuff wasn't in the national database. And then I would interview the person before sentencing and ask him where he's lived all of his life. In all these different places, I would then fax those counties. And I'd find even more crimes that were not reported in the national database. So like you said, a lot of times this stuff just doesn't get put in. And it's only as good as the data put into the system.
Exactly. And, unfortunately, and I say this with no disrespect, I'm a former Texas prosecutor myself. I've worked for the government in that capacity. Government workers are overwhelmed, overworked, very busy. And, the fact that mistakes are going to happen in that process is not surprising at all.
Now, some people will say, okay, let's say even if the Air Force had put that in correctly and he was denied the purchase at the sporting goods store, he still would have found a way to get a gun because in America, in most states, you can go buy a gun from a private citizen on Craigslist and he doesn't have to do a background check. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. In most states, private sales do not require a background check. Federal law does not mandate a background check for private sales. For people who are calling now to, they call this the gun show loophole, which is really inaccurate, but that's
right.
That's what it's, commonly referred to in the media. And people now who are calling for a close to the gun show loophole, it's really a little bit outrageous to me because think about how impossible a law like that would be to enforce. That's so the liberals can pat themselves on the back and say, we did something, and then go on about their day. But really, it would be a meaningless law that only hurt law-abiding gun owners who were trying to rid themselves of a private collection or buy something privately.
Now, how? Explain that, because people say, well, wait a second, if it's that I have to do a background check, then wouldn't I do it the same way a federal gun dealer does and just get the guy's information and call up the number and tell him who it is and I can tell whether I can sell the gun to him or not? Why is that a big deal?
Well, it's a big deal because you can't really enforce it. So, think now that the ATF has a list of federal firearm licensed dealers and they audit them regularly. And that's how they know that those federal firearm licensed dealers are completing the background checks, holding their records the way that they're supposed to. The ATF can't audit every single U.S. citizen to be sure that if they've bought or sold a gun, that they've gone through these proper procedures. And so it's something that just becomes, I think, very taxing. It's meant to chill and restrict Second Amendment rights, and they know full well that there's no true way to enforce the law. It's really so much like saying, let's, the war on drugs. Heroin is illegal. Methamphetamine is illegal. So obviously no one goes to a back alley and purchases or sells it, right?
Right.
Because
in
it's
other
illegal.
words, there's ways around it or it's very hard to enforce. However, people would say, well, at least if you did sell it to somebody who was going to commit a crime and you didn't do the background check and that person commits a crime, then they can trace it back to you and say, hey, you broke the law selling it to them, and now we're going to prosecute you, and that would be a deterrent to just selling to anybody.
It may serve as some deterrent, but again, the chances that something like that happens are fairly slim. And in fact, there are rules right now when it comes to private sale that, do get retroactively enforced occasionally. You can't sell to someone out of state. You can't sell to someone who should not be able to possess a firearm. You can't sell to someone who has expressed to you some ill intent once they get their hands on that firearm. So we do have restrictions in place now for these private sales.
Well, and two things about it. Not a single mass shooter that I've ever heard of bought it in a private gun sale. That's kind of an important thing. And the other thing is, if the individual, like if I was allowed to call up to check the FBI database to see if somebody could buy my gun, that essentially allows me to run a criminal background check on that person. So I could basically say, I don't like my neighbor. I want to see if this guy has a criminal background, and I could just run it through that. I could pretend he's buying the gun from me and get that done. Couldn't I?
Absolutely. It's rife for abuse. Those of us, as a Texas prosecutor, I had to run backgrounds all the time. It's very sensitive information. There was a lot of training that went into it, and if you ran that background when you shouldn't have, you would be fired and prosecuted yourself for it. So it is very sensitive information. We don't want it in the hands of, anyone out there on the street who might engage in some sort of, kind of back alley road to finding out who someone is.
Gotcha. And the last thing is this mental health restrictions. There are people saying, we need more mental health restrictions. However, if you look at the actual details on this, there already are restrictions on people with mental health problems. And in addition, I was just seeing this the other day that, let me make sure I got this right. Here it is. Sorry. I wanted to make sure I had it right for you. During the Obama years, half of the mass public shooters were actually seeing mental health professionals but right before their attacks, and none of them identified them as a threat to others. And so it shows you that, it's not exactly as easy as it sounds. Some people had said, well, Trump has lessened the restrictions that Obama had on for mental health illness having a gun. But what that was senior citizens who were unable to handle their financial affairs anymore and were signing that over to have like their sons or daughters help them with that, were then being told you can't own your guns anymore. That's what that was, right?
Yes. And, President Trump is getting a lot of flack for rolling back that Obama era restriction, but he did the right thing. That restriction was, and many like it that are being proposed now, if you've been diagnosed with this mental health disorder, then you can't own or possess firearms anymore. That is not how we take away constitutional rights from citizens in this country. We have due process rights before the government can strip us of our property or the Second Amendment. And that's why we don't just decide that people go, well, this person may become a danger at some point because they've been diagnosed with depression, so we're just going to take away a constitutional right from them. That's not how our country works. And unfortunately, sometimes that exposes the rest of us to risk, but we don't strip people of their rights who don't deserve to be stripped of their rights in order to prevent a small percentage of people who might be risky to the rest of us.
Yeah, and if you're not careful, that will also make it so some people don't go to get help and makes things worse because they're afraid they're going to have their gun taken away, so they don't get the help they need to get better. So you got to be very careful on it, for sure. Hey, thanks so much for being with us. Emily Taylor, U.S. Law Shield. She's a gun law expert on this, and I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Let's talk to gun owners this morning. Emily Taylor is an independent program attorney for U.S. Law Shield. We'll tell you more about that, but if you're a gun owner, something you're going to want to look into. And Emily, just in a general way, because each state has their own laws, but in a general common sense way, when we see something that happened down in Texas, and we see a guy grab his rifle, jump off the porch, and engage a shooter, what do gun owners need to know in general before they start doing something like that?
Sure. Well, each state has some form of justification for acting in self-defense or defense of others. And what legal justification means is that you can commit what would otherwise be a criminal offense, right? Shooting someone, holding someone at gunpoint, something to that effect. But because you did it to defend the life of yourself or someone else, the law says that you are legally justified, which means you're exempted from that criminal liability. Now, the laws vary state by state, but as a general proposition, you need to act with immediate necessity, and you probably also need to be objectively reasonable in thinking that yourself or someone else needs help.
Okay, that's the key, yourself or someone else. And certainly if a guy is in a church shooting people, there's a lot of somebody else's that need you to intervene.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, this horrible Texas incident was quite interesting under Texas law because as Texas interprets defending others or defending yourself, even if someone has committed a really heinous act, if they've stopped committing that act, you lose your right to defend yourself, to shoot. So this gunman actually happened to be heading towards another church across the street, which is why these Good Samaritans could step in and engage him. But under Texas law, believe it or not, if he had done those horrible things in that church, walked out, rifle down by his side, or dropped the rifle and just walked towards his car, done killing, they actually would not have been able to shoot.
Yeah, I understand that, but I think a lot of people don't. That's confusing for some people. Let's put it more personal. If somebody's in your house, they're robbing your home, and they're not armed, and your life is not in danger, you really can't shoot them, can you?
Well, that varies state by state. Some states will let you shoot in that instance, and some will not. Now, most states have a variant of what we call NRA model castle doctrine. And in Texas, for example, if someone has forcefully and unlawfully entered your home, armed or not, you get the presumption of the castle doctrine, and you can shoot. Now, there are other states that say your life has to be immediately in danger or you're obligated to flee the castle. And it really is one of these instances in which you need to be very familiar with your state law because in the moment, you're not going to have time to think twice. You're just going to have to know instinctively what to do.
But that's where your company comes in, U.S. Law Shield, Texas and U.S. Law Shield, uslawshield.com, because you help the gun owner in these situations.
Absolutely. Texas and U.S. Law Shield is a service for gun owners in the, hopefully what never happens, but in this circumstance where you may have to defend yourself, defend someone else, or defend your property, either with your firearm or with any other legal weapon that you have. And Texas Law Shield and U.S. Law Shield members pay generally $10.95 a month, and what they get in return for that is free attorneys, no legal fees at all. If they have to use their firearm or weapon, they get either sued civilly or charged criminally as a result of that. They also get the benefit of being able to call in to the business line any given day and ask attorneys in their state questions about gun laws and self-defense laws.
Our basic message here is know your state laws now before you need to know them, before you have to act. And you might want to check out uslawshield.com. Emily Taylor, independent program attorney, and our guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you.